Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this opportunity. We thank you that so many came out in the pouring down rain, and it would have been a night that would have been so easy to stay home. But I'm thankful for those that came out. I'm thankful for those that are going to tune in. And Lord, just let everything that flows from this altar be from you. Remind us that we are called and created with a purpose. Jesus. Whew. Man, y'all, God is so good. I feel bad for people who don't have a church like this. Because unless you've been in a church like this, you don't know what you're missing. You don't have a clue. And it's amazing how the Spirit flows and moves. To see people healed and set free every time these doors are open. Every time the doors have opened. I've not been in here one time that somebody has not gotten healed, set free. Not a lot of churches can say that. So I'm going to tie that in hopefully at the end, because not only are those things happening in each of you, because God's calling you deeper. The whole theme of Esther is for such a time as this, and seeing God's providence work throughout the whole book. There's a reason, right? To remind us we have to go deeper. You can't stay where you're at, because if you keep your butt on this pew for 40 years, you're going to smell like an old piece of Limburger cheese for long. That's not what you're called to do. People aren't drawn to things that stink. Nope. Not at all. You're drawn to light. So what is your light? What are you putting out? So I'm just going to do a little review, and we are going to finish Esther tonight. Thank you. That's all the Lord. So we know that the name of God is not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther, the only book. Esther was raised by her cousin Mordecai and treated as his own daughter. Mordecai was very, very strong-willed and very, very proud to be Jewish, and he did not bow to anybody else. Because of that, Haman despised him. And we know that feud went back 1,000 years from their ancestors. Haman hated the Jews so much that he wanted to kill all of the Jews, and he deceived King Xerxes, made a decree that they would all be killed. But Mordecai, Esther, prayed, fasted. God's favor was all over her. She got the meeting with the king, and I forgot my scepter tonight. I grabbed the wrong bag. I was going to bring my scepter back tonight. But he had favor, God's favor. King met with her. So now we're back to the banquet. Good stuff. We kind of ended last week in Daniel, and we talked about how with God's favor you can walk through the fire, and we brought up Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and how the fire that they had to face was so hot, the guards died before they ever got to the fire. But those three walked through the fire unharmed, no smoke, no singeing, nothing. God was with them. Jesus could be in the fire. They didn't say anything. They just said, we're not going to bow to your God. And our God carried them through the whole fire. Nothing happened to them. God carries us that way too. I'm sure every one of you can think of a situation where it should have ended much different than it did, but God's favor was with you. You walked through that fiery furnace and you came out unscathed. Yeah, it's exactly what has happened with Esther. She's had to walk through a lot. Her parents died. She could have been killed. But she said, for such a time as this. And if I perish, I perish. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, we die. But we are not going to bow to your God. And that reminded us that there's people every day who die for their belief. There's people who hate us because of what we do. That's sad. And you don't know, the day may come where you may have to make that decision, and what's going to be your decision such a time as this. Hopefully you will have the strength in the Lord, and you will be grounded enough in this to be able to stand firm, because this is where your faith starts. You have to have a prayer life. You have to be in the Word every day. If you just read a few scriptures every day, you have to start somewhere. My thing is, a new Christian, I encourage them to start in the book of John, the book of love. The love that pours out of the book of John reminds you of how loved you are. Read a few sentences every day, but start. And then that love grows, your love for the Word grows, and then you just want more and more and more of it. Can't get enough of it. That's an addiction that's good. There's a lot of bad addiction, but that's a good one. That's a good one. So 3 days had passed. The queen knew she must approach the king. She does. Haman was so excited because he knew he was going to get to have dinner with the queen and the king. As he was headed home, the rain happens on his parade, and not the good rain, not the rain we were just singing about, but his parade got rained on. Mordecai would not stand for him when he went by. And it made Haman so mad that he trembled. He got home. He calls for his wife and his kids and his friends to all come in. He brags about everything that has happened, all the favor that he has with the king, and the queen's invited him to a banquet, but he's still so mad that Mordecai would not bow to him. Mordecai is a Jew sitting at the king's gate, and he would not honor Haman, and that ran all over him. So Haman's wife and his friends suggest that they build gallows for Mordecai to be hung, which was really being impaled. We know that didn't end so well for him. When at the banquet, the plot twist happened, King Xerxes asked Esther, whatever she wants, whatever you want, I will give you, up to half the kingdom. And we talked like that is a metaphor. He wasn't really going to give her half the kingdom, but it shows affection. It shows how much he loves her and he cares for her. He wants her to be happy. And husbands, you do want your wives to be happy, right? That's important. So remember that part. Happy wife, happy life. It's important. It's important. When the queen exposes the plot of Haman, he is completely blindsided. He thinks he has all this favor with the king and the queen, and she exposes him for who he is. And the king realizes what he's done. He realizes that he is about to allow all of the Jews to be killed, and his wife is a Jew. I really don't think that he knew up until that point that she was Jewish. There was never, it's not in the Word. I mean, it could have happened, but I really don't think that he knew that. I think I jumped ahead a little bit there. Got my papers a little mixed up. Sorry about that. Haman had planned to hang Mordecai on his way back. We're going to go to chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. So Haman came in. So the king had been up. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. The king had been up. He couldn't sleep. And he has the book of records brought to him. And he reads that Mordecai was never honored for saving his life. And he wants to know who's in the courtyard. Just so happens that Haman's coming in. And so the king calls for Haman to come in. And when Haman gets in there, the king says, "What should be done to a man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "For a man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and whose head a royal crown is set. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.' Then the king said to Haman, 'Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned.'" So Haman is really upset now. He thinks all of that's for him. That is pride at its best, right? He thinks he is so much better, and he's not. So Mordecai is getting a great honor, and he has to be led by Haman. You got to wonder what Mordecai's thinking. We shouldn't be the na, but you wonder if he's not, like, see, I told you I wasn't going to bow to you. Now you have to lead me around town and show everybody what I've done. You don't know. There's definitely a plot twist. But then we get to the second banquet, and that's in chapter 7. At the second banquet, Esther is pleading with the king to save her people, as I said a while ago. And I doubt that she spoke softly when she calls out Haman for the wickedness. I just don't think she would. Deceiving that he was, you can imagine the look on Haman's face when he hears the words. And that's in chapter 7, 5 and 6. Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who has dared to do this?" And the Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. He was just called out. He was exposed for the evil, the plan that he tried to do. As the king was so mad and he left the room, Haman goes to the queen, and they recline, so they don't sit at a banquet. They weren't sitting at a table and chairs like we sat at. They're reclining on lounges, and the tables are low. And he goes over to her, and he's pleading for her, and he's leaning over her, I'm sure. Well, the king comes back in, and he sees that. He has him immediately arrested. And lo and behold, one of the guards says, he calls out to King Xerxes' attention that the gallows are there. These are the gallows that Haman had built to kill Mordecai on. The king immediately has him put to death, put on the gallows, and they are impaled. So you're put on these stakes, and it was approximately 75 feet. So somebody is put on the stake, and then the stakes are raised. So somebody is literally just hanging on that pole for everybody to see. There's a little bit of, I don't know what's a good word. I think there was sometimes less crime when those things were done publicly, maybe. It's a good example. I don't want no part of that, right? I don't want to end up in the middle of the town. And yesterday, the Lord and I when we were studying, he kept bringing back the crucifixion. I've studied the crucifixion a lot, and you always think of Jesus hanging on the cross, and he always has clothes. But truly, when people were crucified, they were stripped naked. That was part of the humiliation of it. And a lot of times, any of these kind of things that was part of the humiliation. So not only did you have to be tormented or tortured or stabbed or beaten or whatever the sentencing was, it was done completely naked. So it's a little more of the humiliation and the punishment that happens with all of that. It's a little scary. So now the enemy is put to death. And now the plan has to change. So the decree's gone out. All the Jews are supposed to die. So the king allows Esther and Mordecai to come up with a plan to save everybody. And they do. So we talked earlier about the signet ring. The king had gotten that back from Haman. Now he turns it over to Mordecai. And he lets Mordecai write the new decree. And in the new decree, all the Jews are allowed to defend themselves and take plunder, if they want to, from the ones who are coming to attack them. And you got to remember how big Persia is a huge kingdom, right? We talked about how many different, at least 20 regions, a lot of different dialects, people from different areas. So all these decrees had to go out in their own language, and they had to go out very, very quickly to a large area. And we know that in that day, the day that all the Jews were supposed to die, They do not. They're saved. They're saved because Esther listened to what the Lord was telling her to do. The word God is not in the book, but they were people of prayer. They knew to stop. They knew to stop, fast, and pray. There's a reason we fast here in our church. Fasting is so important, and Josh touched on it on Sunday a little bit more even. It breaks our flesh. It removes our self. There's a reason that we have to say we must decrease and the Lord must increase. For us to decrease, you got to separate ourselves from the Word. If you just fast, if you start fasting, you give up breakfast. So instead of eating breakfast, you spend that time in the Word and time in prayer. And then maybe the Lord will lead you to give up 2 meals. There's people in our church that when we do the 3-day fast, they only drink water. They don't eat at all. You work up to those things. Most times. Some people can just do it. But don't feel like, I can't do that. You have to start somewhere. Maybe it's just giving up social media for 3 days. That's a start. That's a sacrifice for some people. Maybe it's giving up your favorite TV shows. Maybe your favorite podcast. It's something. But we can all start somewhere. So it's important. Then I know this church does the big fast in January. So if you start now, maybe just 1 day a week doing something, you'll be ready for a bigger fast. And there are many breakthroughs that happen through fasting. Just like we've seen in Esther. She called for everybody to fast for 3 days. They fasted and they prayed. Saved an entire nation. They can save a nation in 3 days of fasting and praying. What can we do in this community and what can we do in our church by fasting 1 day a week? Man, lot great. So Esther and Haman, they saved the Jews. Now we're going to jump over. We're going to go to chapter 8. I have highlighted 15 through 17. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in the royal robes of blue and white with a golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews and a feast and a holiday. So they had went from living in terror and fear, knowing that they were all going to die. Remember the edict, it didn't matter. It was women, men, and children. It didn't make any difference who you were, what age you were. You think that somebody's coming to kill your children? No. Most of you guys are parents in here. You're going to be a little upset and you're going to be defensive. You're told you can't do anything about it. It's a little hard to swallow. So you can imagine when they got the word that now you're going to be saved and you can defend yourself if anybody comes against you, you're going to be pretty excited. And now Mordecai is getting great recognition. He's now made like the prime minister in the kingdom, the king's right-hand man. When they arrived at the day, Haman wanted all the Jews killed. You see God's providence again, because God allowed the escape in justice. The Jews defended themselves, and they killed over 500 men just in Susa. That doesn't count all the providences where they defended themselves, but not one Jew was killed. Not one. Not one Jew was killed. The commentary for mine on verse 17 said, fear of Jews had fallen on them. Not only did God enable the Jews to defend themselves, but he also caused the people of the land to fear the Jews. So it totally flipped. The script completely flipped. That is to say, God's people in truth gained power and influence through Haman's wicked plot. So not only where they didn't think the Jews were important, they could be disposed of, now they see what God has done and how important the Jews are to God. And if he can do that to the Jews, maybe we should have some respect for them. I think God's going to do that for us. We are going to face great persecution, but God is going to protect his. Yes. So we can't live in that fear. It's easy to go there, just like the Jews were afraid. It's easy for us to get there sometimes when you think about everything that's going on. And I know we're excited about the election. It doesn't mean that there's still not evil out there prowling around. You still have to pray for this nation to have protection. You have to pray for your brothers and sisters. That doesn't stop because of the election. Have to do that. So, here. When we get to the end, remember it started with a feast. King Xerxes was celebrating in the very beginning when we started in Esther. I said it started with a feast and it ends with a feast. So now all the Jews are saved. Everyone is happy. Everyone's excited. Mordecai gets the recognition that he deserves. And what happens now, they make this a holiday. It's called the Feast of Purim. It is still celebrated in Israel today. It's a multi-day feast, multi-day celebration. They celebrate all of the Jews being saved. That is the one day in the synagogues, the entire book of Esther is read. They celebrate the freedom that they got, God's favor, the providence of God. They celebrate it by giving gifts to each other. It's just a huge day of celebration. So you can imagine that we have a lot to celebrate. We celebrate the 4th of July, and I know I'm almost 59 years old. When I was a kid, it was a much grander holiday. I think too many people take it for granted now. I think it's a little better for us because we're so close to Fort Knox, so we understand the military support and we understand the greatness that we still have in this nation. But a lot of things we tend to take for granted, and that's what we got to think about and not do, because we can never take this for granted. Ever. God is always going to be with you, but God never leaves you. It is us who tends to walk away from Him. And we can never take our relationship with the Lord for granted. You need to always be nurturing that relationship. So I said to be in prayer every day, even if they're short. You've got to start somewhere. You've got to keep fueling that fire. If you do not communicate with your spouse, what happens to that relationship? It's almost non-existent. You just become like passing in the hallway, grunt at each other or whatever, and things go away. Things die. If you don't keep a fire stoked, it dies. The embers die. Your relationship with the Lord is the same way. You have to keep working at it. You have to keep pressing in, set apart that time to spend time in prayer. And this has been the biggest lesson for me in the last couple years, to not just talk, but to listen. Be still and know. That was my scripture 2 years ago that He gave me. And sometimes there's a reason we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? Yeah. We should listen twice as much as we talk. I've been guilty of the opposite. I've been guilty of talking twice as much as I listen. So it's a process that you learn, but the Lord speaks to us. Sometimes He speaks to us through a friend. Sometimes He just speaks to us through the Word. But you have got to keep fueling that. You got to stoke that fire, or it's going to die. I've got to die. So that concludes Esther, but this is what I want you to think about. So there's several lessons that we learn in Esther. We see God's providence. We know that pride will come before a fall. When we please God, we can find favor even among our enemies. Stay focused on God no matter the situation. God's timing is always perfect and final. If we desire evil for others, it can easily come back on us. But think about this. So Esther knew what her purpose was. She knew what her calling was. Do you know what God's calling you to do for such a time as this? Because our callings change in different seasons. Sometimes we're just studying to absorb, and sometimes we're to share. Sometimes you're to pray. But you have to start somewhere. And your seasons may change, but what are you supposed to be doing in this season? This is a season where people tend to either be very, very sad when you get into the holidays because of things that have happened in their lives, or they tend to get really excited and they love the holidays. I know somebody who's decorated their whole house already for Christmas. And I know we're not supposed to be envious, but usually I've done that by now and I've not had time. So she may be. But you can take that joy with you everywhere. And you can take those moments when you see somebody struggling and just pray for them. You don't have to pray a long, drawn-out prayer. It can be as, hey, can I pray for you? See, you're struggling. I want to ask God to help. It can be that simple. God hears it all. It doesn't have to be this big, eloquent, 3-page prayer. It doesn't have to. Maybe somebody just needs a little help. What we're getting ready to do for the schools is amazing. That is a very simple act of being the hands and feet of Christ that is going to bless those families. So those are all the things that maybe you're called to teach. Maybe you're called to preach. Maybe you're called to work with the kids. That is going to grow in this church. It's been prophesied. We are going to need, probably eventually we're going to need to split up and have different age groups. We're going to have youth. We're going to have young kids. We're going to have the nursery workers. So it's time. And we need those things because we need the kids to be learning at their level. So mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, we have a lot of grandparents raising kids, can be up here and being fed. When you can feed the adults, and the kids are getting fed at their level, that all goes back home. Then it spreads out into the community. That's what we're all called to do in our own way. That's all I got.